Spurgeon once remarked that as every English town and village has a road going to London, so from every text in Scripture, there is a road to the metropolis of the Scriptures that is Christ. He added, I have never yet found a text that had not got a road to Christ in it, and if I ever do find one that has not a road to Christ in it, I will make one. Many pastors and scholars concur that every Old Testament passage relates ultimately in some way to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Others would say, not so fast, citing what they believe are examples of creative yet forced attempts to find Christ in the Old Testament, such as Justin's claim that Rahab's scarlet thread signifies Jesus' blood, or various allegorical readings of the Song of Songs, from Hippolytus to Bernard. How should Christians today understand the relationship of the Old Testament to Christ? Some studies of Christ in the Old Testament adopt a forward-looking approach to the development of messianic expectations within the law, prophets, and writings. Along these lines, you may examine the 39 uses of the Hebrew word Mashiach, anointed or anointed one, in the Old Testament, with particular focus on texts such as Psalm 2, verse 2, the earth's kings rise up against the Lord and against his anointed, and the enigmatic reference to the Anointed One in Daniel chapter 9, verses 25 and 26. For example, Andrew Abernethy and Greg Goswell thoroughly explored the Old Testament hopes of a coming king to carry out God's kingdom purposes, considering various texts that prefigure, predict, or depict a royal messianic figure. Scholars also examine the historical development of Jewish messianic expectation during the Second Temple period. For example, Joseph Fitzmyer detects few traces of messianism in the Old Testament scriptures, but explores the widespread and diverse messianic hopes among Jews during the Second Temple period. Well-known examples of the Dead Sea Scrolls discussion of the coming prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel, the Community Rule, chapter 9, verse 11, and Psalms of Solomon, chapter 17, verse 21, to chapter 18, verse 9, which speaks of the Lord's Messiah, the Davidic son who will one day rule righteously over Israel and destroy their enemies, drawing on Old Testament texts like Psalm 2 and Isaiah chapter 11. Others adopt a backward-looking approach to Christ in the Old Testament, examining the Old Testament in light of the New Testament's testimony about Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. For example, Richard Hayes explains that the evangelists reread the scriptures following Christ's resurrection and purposes. We learn to read the Old Testament by reading backwards from the Gospels, and at the same time, we learn how to read the Gospels by reading forwards from the Old Testament. Key questions for the debate. With these differing approaches to the question, how should Christians today read the Old Testament in light of Christ? This book, 5 Views of Christ in the Old Testament, takes as a given that Jesus Christ is, in some sense, the one who fulfills the Old Testament scriptures. What this means in practice, however, is what this book is all about. The contributors and editors are Christian biblical scholars and theologians from North America, the United Kingdom, and India, who write for Christian readers. They wrestle with a number of hermeneutical and biblical theological questions, such as the following. How do you understand the nature, unity, and progression of the Scriptures? And what role does the New Testament play in your interpretation of Old Testament texts? What is the relationship between the intentions of the human authors and editors of the Old Testament and the divine author? What criteria are necessary for identifying connections to Christ in the Old Testament? What specific steps should Christian readers take to responsibly study the Old Testament in light of Christ? How does your approach to Christ in the Old Testament benefit readers? Each of these questions uncovers the presuppositions and methodology of the contributors and provides crucial context for the interpretive moves that follow. To help readers see the similarities and differences of these views on Christ in the Old Testament, the contributors engage the same 3 case studies: Genesis chapter 22, Proverbs chapter 8, and Isaiah chapter 40.